Okay, we're back again. I hope you guys can click on pretty quickly. So, we are in chapter 14 of Genesis. Now, we find that Lot has gone ahead and he's headed toward Sodom and Gomorrah. He's headed toward Sodom. He's near Sodom. In verse, I have to take off my glasses to look at this. In verse 12, Abram lived in the land of Canaan while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now we see this happening with Sodom here in see this with Lot headed towards Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were greatly wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. That's verse 12. Now I want us to go ahead and find out and follow Lot's progression before we go ahead and finish talking about Abram here. We see here he's near the tent. Now if you go ahead and turn the page, probably turn your page, over to verse 12, we see that he has come down and he is now, they also carried off. So this, we'll talk about who carried him off, but now he's living in Sodom. So Lot has gotten not just near Sodom, now he's moved into Sodom, which is where these 5 kings have begun to attack Sodom, and they carried them all off and everybody with them. So there's a progression we see in Lot's life. He was with Abram. Abram had the promise of the Lord. He was following God with Abram. He was following the Lord through Abram. And then when given the opportunity to go out and strike out on his own, he moves east, which is away from the Lord. It's away from the promises. He's moved away from where Abram is. And so now he's going to go live near Sodom, back here at verse of 13, verse 12. But we turn to chapter 14, verse 12, and he's living in Sodom. Oh my goodness. So he's moved away from Abraham just a bit. Now he's near Sodom. Now he's living in Sodom. Now there's one more progression that we see later, because after Abram rescues him and takes him, he goes back to where he was, which is not a very bright idea. So we go ahead and turn on over to chapter 19. Come on over 19 really quickly. In verse 1, and it says, when the 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. So to sit in the gateway means that he became a leader of that community, which really makes sense because Abram was the one who rescued them. And Abram was of course, his uncle. And so it would have been known to the king of Sodom who Lot was, because his relative is the one who came and attacked these 5 kings and took him and saved everyone in that area and let them go back home. I mean, that was a big deal, because if you think about 5 kings Abram coming against 5 kings, what that meant was 5 kings, they would have had thousands of men with them. Maybe 50, maybe even 100,000 men. But let's say they only had 5,000 men. When we see how many people Abram had with him, he had 318 trained men, which seems like a lot just for basically a nomad to have with him. So that's how many trained men, not just shepherds, not the kids who didn't have any training. 318 armed, ready for battle men that could fight were his servants, were the people that were with him. That lets you know how wealthy he was, which was a lot. If you think about small companies in the United States, how many of them have 318 employees? I mean, that's it's still considered a small company. It's not a nation by any stretch yet, but the Lord has blessed him to that level. So he comes against these kings and he overpowers them. He pursues them for the first 125 miles, and then another 45 miles. When we look at the progression, you look at this on a map, pursued him to Dan and then north of Damascus. So he's traipsing around with his men and following these guys, and eventually he, at night, is able to overtake them. Of course, at night, the men didn't know how many there were. They didn't know there were just 318 to overthrow thousands. Anyway, that's kind of a side note. But we see what is going on with Lot is this progression of sin. He was near Sodom, then he was in Sodom, and now he's a leader of Sodom by the time that the angels come and rescue him and Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. So in our lives, we have to make sure and guard ourselves against this walking away thing. If we have been following someone else and said, it's really great to follow you around, but I think I'm going to go my own way now. We always need to go toward the west. And what I mean by that is that we need to draw closer to the Lord. And we shouldn't base our faith on someone else's experience. And that's what I think Lot was doing. He was basing his relationship with the one true God on Abram's experience, which gave him this emotional freedom to just kind of walk away because it wasn't a firsthand experience. It's the greatest challenge for us is to pass on our faith to our children, to pass on our faith to those that we love at church, to our neighbors, because we know that they have to have a firsthand, they can't rely on us. So we have to be careful not to puff ourselves up to the place that we make ourselves the one that someone is trying to be exactly like. We want them to be like the Lord. And I don't mean that we're not supposed to be a good example. That's not what I mean at all. But if we see someone that it looks like that their faith is being relied upon my faith, that can happen for a little while. But after a time, when they start going through their own trials, then they have to be able to have that firsthand experience with God. So we need to pray to lead those that are following after us, that they start following God and stop following us. And that sometimes is a painful thing, that when we know that we have to let them go so that they can serve the Lord with their whole heart, with who they are. They've got to have that firsthand experience and teach them how to have that. Not just teach them how to mimic what I'm doing, but teach them how to have a firsthand experience with God. We see in Psalms chapter 1, kind of coming back to this idea about what Lot was doing. And it says here, "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the step with the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the company of mockers." It's interesting because it's exactly what Lot's life looked like. He began to walk. He walked away from Abraham, and then we see him he's in Sodom, and now he's sitting. But we have to be careful to guard ourselves against those patterns. If we find ourselves walking, and we're just kind of walking away from the Lord, and then we're just kind of standing around waiting to see what's going to happen, eventually we'll be sitting. And when we're sitting and we're not actively pursuing God, that's when the real trouble comes. So next up, we're going to talk about Melchizedek. It's a valuable lesson, you guys. You jump back in with me, and we'll be here in just a minute.